Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Israel says it has hit dozens of targets in Syria belonging to the government and allied Iranian forces. Early Wednesday, IDF tweeted that it had struck Iran's Quds Force and Syrian armed forces targets, and the wide-scale strikes were a response to rockets fired by an Iranian unit into Israel. Israel has carried out hundreds of strikes in Syria since the civil war broke out in 2011. It claims that its actions are meant to thwart what it calls Iran's military entrenchment in Syria and to block shipments of Iranian weapons to Lebanon's Hezbollah movement. But the latest operation is reported to be more broad in scope. According to a senior Israeli security official, Tel Aviv had decided on a powerful retaliatory strike to signal they were changing the rules, i.e., even a small attack from Syria would trigger an extensive response. Is Israeli aggression justified? To discuss this, we are joined by Maram Susli, who's a Syrian analyst, joins us from Perth. And we also have with us George Szamuely, who is a Middle East expert based in Budapest. But before we open the discussion with our panelists, let's revisit the concepts of preemption and prevention. The doctrine of preemption in terms of anticipatory self-defense was formulated by the Bush administration in the National Security Strategy document after the 9/11 attack. The concept and its execution goes beyond the narrow principle preemption. It seeks to attack preemptively even without a definite and imminent threat. The fact is that the use of force for self-defense is lawful only if an armed attack occurs against the state, not if one is likely to occur. Customary international law permits preemptive self-defense only when a threat is so grave and imminent that the victim cannot wait to act in self-defense until the attack has actually started. Israel has been conflating the concepts of preemption and preventive actions much before the US came up with the idea of anticipatory self-defense. Its attack on an Iraqi Osiris reactor is a glaring example of that. Codenamed Operation Babylon, Israel launched an airstrike against the target on 7 June 1981. It has undertaken other preventive actions. Most strategic literature talks about Israel's preference for anticipatory strikes. The doctrine forms the core of Israeli politico-strategic thinking. Now, having revisited this, let's get to our panel. Let's begin with Maram Susli. Maram, the latest attack, and Israel says it is changing the rules of the game, i.e., even a small attack is going to get a major response. So this is not about proportionality.
Well, that kind of language is just intimidatory. There's nothing really behind it. They don't, this is something that they say to try to prevent any retaliatory strikes. The fact of the matter is that Syria has once shot down an Israeli jet, and Israel didn't escalate beyond what it is already doing, which is consistently attacking Syria for the last few years and bombing military targets within Syria illegally under international law, breaching the sovereignty of Syria. And their claim to self-defense doesn't wash because Israel is illegally occupying Syrian territory, the Golan Heights. And as such, they have no right to self-defense because they're already committing an offense against the Syrian state. In any action that Syria takes against Israel is self-defense. At the end of the day, the state of Israel in itself is illegal, and Syria does not recognize its existence, along with many other nations in the world. A third of the United Nations don't recognize Israel as a country. It's more like ISIS, something that is attempting to be a state on other people's land based on theocratic and extremist religious ideas.
Maram, that's what I said in my opening also, that the Israeli politico-strategic strategy, the core principle of that is anticipatory self-defense. And there's a lot of strategic literature on that. And specifically, that's because it does not have enough depth and for various other reasons also. But here's the thing. Syria itself, since 2011, is territory, but territory that has been still being controlled by multiple factions. There's been a lot of infighting. We know the civil war has, claimed so many lives. So, viewed from that perspective, Syria's sovereignty has already been breached by a number of actors. So what sovereignty are we essentially talking about? Because the Israeli logic here is that the Iranians are based, entrenched on Syrian territory, and it's the Iranian targets that Israel is actually engaging.
Well, even if that is their logic, that is still against international law. Iran, if it is in Syria legally under the invitation of the Syrian government. So there's no legitimized way of saying, oh, well, they're just targeting Iran. Iran is Syria's guest. But at the same time, these are lies that the Israelis are once again pushing, that, oh, they're only targeting Iran inside Syria, as if that's some kind of justification. In reality, they are targeting the Syrian military, because at the end of the day, they see the Syrian civil war as an easy way to destroy Syria further, and basically Syria being too weak in its current state in the midst of war to be able to mount any kind of retaliation that would prevent them from going further. So this is just a vulture going in for the kill when they see that the target is weakened. And of course, the entire Syrian civil war was pushed by the United States and Israel because they wanted to destroy Syria. At the end of the day, they armed these rebels, they gave them military and medical aid. They themselves admitted that they gave the rebels money and medical aid. So Israel has been really pushing for the civil war in an attempt to destroy as much of Syria as possible. And
Okay, Maram, stay with me. Pull in George Szamuely here. George, one can assail this issue from various angles. Of course, there is the issue of the fault lines within Syria that have been exploited by a number of actors within Syria also, and external actors also. But the Israeli strategy has always been, as I said, anticipatory self-defense. And that is something which it cannot be attested by what we have currently in international law in terms of the definition of preemption. And there's also a conflation of preemption with prevention. Any thoughts on that, George?
Of course, it's illegal. As you said in your introduction, preemption might have some validity under international law if there's a real and direct, immediate threat of attack. But Israel's theory is that it's attacking Syria because Iran is transferring missiles across Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there's no way that Israel can justify its attack by claiming that it is under any kind of immediate threat. I mean, it hasn't even reached Hezbollah in Lebanon, so therefore you can't invoke that as a direct and immediate threat. And again, the attacks are also coming at the Syrian military. So it's quite false to say, well, we're only attacking the Iranians. They are also attacking Syrian military forces.
So their argument is, because I don't have an Israeli on the panel, so I'm just putting that sort of black cap on. But their argument is that because Syrians have allowed the Iranians to entrench, and of course the Iranian forces are on Syrian bases, so therefore Syrians are responsible, and the Syrian armed forces will also become a collateral damage in any targeting of the Iranian forces on Syrian territory.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly their argument. But of course, it's a spurious argument. I mean, imagine if everyone started arguing along those lines and then think in terms of, well, I've got this distant threat that might come from a third country, so I'm going to hit another country because they're transferring missiles there. And if there's collateral damage, and I'm going to target and hit and kill citizens of that other country, then that's fine with us. But nobody else does this. I mean,
I totally agree with you, George, because obviously, as you know very well, there can be no limiting principle to this kind of argument. And in fact, If we just go back a couple of weeks, I mean, what they did in Gaza in terms of assassinating the leader of, one of the leaders of Islamic Jihad is again something which simply cannot be defended on the basis of international law. Of course, realpolitik and show of force is a completely different thing. But as I said in my opening, and I maintain that, there have been a number of examples of Israeli military strategic action in terms of preemption. And as far as the Iraqi reactor is concerned, it was a complete conflation of preemption with prevention.
Yes, absolutely. But what's interesting is that when they did that in 1981, I remember this was in the Reagan administration. During the Reagan administration, the United States condemned what Israel did and did not attempt to justify Israel's action, which was a nakedly aggressive act. Yeah. Today, it would be inconceivable. I mean, if Israel were to do something like this today, and in fact, they did do this in 2007 against Syria, also claiming, they're building a kind of nuclear weapons site or whatever. Yeah. America would just say, yeah, fine, we support this. We're all for it. That's just a measure of how much the United States has now moved into a nakedly apologetic state for Israel. So whatever Israel does, whomever it kills, whoever it destroys, there's always the U.S. administration and the 535 members of Congress ready to say, yep, Israel was fully justified because Israel was acting in self-defense.
Absolutely. And stay with me, George. In fact, an interesting point is, and you'll recall this, that post 9/11, as this whole sort of, NSS document talked about anticipatory self-defense, there was also an attempt at an intellectual, conceptual level by some of the legal minds in the U.S. to try and unlock Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and to try and put a different kind of construct on the sort of, interpretation of that article. So this has been going on for a while, and I completely agree with you that if Israel does this today, and it's been doing this post 9/11, the U.S. is not going to object to that. But Maram, here's the thing. Going back to what you said, and I agree with you, because the Israelis neutralized Jordan and they neutralized Egypt, and in the outer circle they had Syria, Iraq, and Libya. All three countries essentially over the last 17, 18 years have been destabilized, have faced and are facing civil wars. But the fault lines were within these countries. Now, so the issue really is, how do these Arab states conceive of those fault lines? How does the state attempt to create a constitutional compact in view of the aspirations of its people? Now, that is a big question, and we saw that during the Arab Spring. We're again witnessing civil unrest in Iraq. We're witnessing it in Lebanon. But the answer to this question is still not forthcoming.
Well, it's my view that there is no political solution to the situation in Syria. It's going to be a military solution at the end of the day. The Syrian government is going to go into Idlib and get rid of the Al-Qaeda groups and their allies. They're also going to eventually be able to get rid of the US occupation and its Kurdish proxy, the YPG or SDF, whatever acronym they're choosing to use now. It's only going to be a matter of time. And there's not going to be a constitution that is created that's going to suddenly make the US or the GCC, Gulf Arab countries, or Turkey happy, because the Syrian state has already made it clear since 2011 that they're not willing to bend down to the hegemony of the United States, and they're going to withstand and be independent.
Maram, hold up. Maram, hold this thought. See, my question is essentially related to the internal fault lines. Now, much before the external actors jumped into the fray, as they did, and obviously they're exploiting the situation, the fact is that the entire thing started within Syria. And it started within Syria because people demanded rights. And the sops that Bashar al-Assad was offering them, They rejected that. And then, of course, there was regime repression. And then there was retaliation from the groups. And then we suddenly saw the entire societal fabric coming apart. So the essential issue there is, how do you get for the Syrian people to express what kind of constitutional compact they want? They never got that.
The problem is that the demands of the insurgent groups that are the ones holding the weapons, the ones pushing this entire war, are basically you cannot negotiate with, because they want.
No, but we got to this situation. But Maram, we got to this situation. We got to this situation because when the regime did not address people's concerns and their aspirations in any meaningful, non-violent way, that's the time when the government started oppressing the people and people started getting killed, the protesters, that's when people picked up the arms. So let's get the direction of causality right here.
Unfortunately, that's not exactly the truth, because there was already soldiers and police officers being killed within the first 3 months. The fact of the matter is the demands of the insurgency, though a small group of the protesters wanted an end to corruption, which they're completely right about. The wave of the largest wave amongst the protesters politically was the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and their demands was theocracy. Their demands was an oppression of the minority groups, and that's something that is never going. Their demands were that to break up the Iran-Syria alliance, because the Iranians were Shiites, and that's something that the Syrian people as a whole are not going to accept, and that is why the insurgency failed, because they are not waving the flag of the entirety of the Syrian people. They don't represent Syria's will or the will of the Syrian people. They represent their minority, their theocratic, ideological thoughts, and that's why they've been so compatible with forces like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And there's just no negotiating with these terrorists, just as there's no negotiating with Israel, because they're just a Jewish version of ISIS.
Okay, right. Stay with me. Let me hop over to George here. George, the same question to you. I mean, my concerns in terms of the direction of causality, in terms of internal fault lines. But I also, once you respond to this, I also want you to give me a sense of the Iranian role in the Greater Middle East, specifically in Syria and in Lebanon.
Well, to address your first question, there were undoubtedly legitimate grievances in Syria. However, the violence on the part of the rebels started almost immediately. I mean, so there really wasn't too much of a peaceful movement, and the jihadis were in charge almost from the beginning. And you don't have to listen to what the Syrian government says. What the United States government, the defense agency, United States government found. 2012 said there really is nothing in between the government and the Salafists. The opposition is completely controlled by the Salafists. So that was it. That was the opposition. And there was really only one way of solving the problem, which was, unfortunately, through military means, which became very difficult when other countries became involved and supported the Salafists. But now we're 8 years on. So there's really little point now in arguing about what happened in 2011. I mean, the way forward is through the constitutional negotiations going on in Sochi and so on, and see if some kind of a workable constitutional framework can be developed, and that's going to be hard work.
Okay, George, quickly, the Iranian role. I need to wrap up this segment also. The Iranian role in Syria and Lebanon.
A regional power. I mean, it's a serious country. It's a serious power. It's not just some ridiculous tribal state, run by one powerful tribal family.
I get your hint. Go on.
Yeah. So and it does see itself as the defender of the Shia. I mean, the Shia are a minority in the Muslim world, and who's going to protect them but the leading Shia power, which is Iran. And it's ridiculous for the United States to wage this ongoing war to minimize Iran's influence, because Iran isn't going away anywhere. The Persians have been around.
But there's also a bit of the realpolitik, George, here, because I mean the Iranians are also supporting Hamas, and Hamas is not a Shia group, and so there's a bit of that, as you rightly said, a regional power, projecting power also. But I have run out of time. Thank you so much, George Szamuely, for speaking with us, and also Maram Susli. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the developments in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. 2 U.S. service members were killed in a helicopter crash, the U.S. military statement said. The cause of the crash is under investigation. However, preliminary reports do not indicate it was caused by enemy fire. The Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid tweeted the U.S. Chinook helicopter shot down and completely destroyed last night while trying to raid Mujahideen location in Pangram area of Sart Logar. The Afghan government has also ruled out the involvement of Taliban in the crash. The crash comes a day after the Taliban swapped 2 Western hostages for 3 of its commanders held by the Afghan government. The swap has raised hopes of a thaw in relations between the armed group and coalition forces. Meanwhile, the Afghan Election Commission announced postponing the results of presidential elections last week. This is the second postponement. The results were to be declared on 14th November. There's also no movement on the peace track. The last visit of U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad to Kabul was on 27th October. What exactly is happening in that country? And also, I have to say, because I had Wahid Musda, who said last night in Kabul, the senior journalist and analyst, and was also guest on this program. So that's obviously a very sad development. In any case, we'll probably talk about that also. In fact, one of our panelists is currently at the funeral of Mr. Musda, and when we get hold of him, we're going to ask him about what the latest development there is. But what are the various developments? And for that, we have Imtiaz Gul, who joins us from Islamabad, as a writer, also heads his own think tank, has observed Afghanistan for many, many years now. Mariam Wardak, who's a journalist, analyst based in Kabul. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Mariam. Mariam, what's going on? I mean, the peace track is all quiet on that. We really don't know where it's going. The Taliban are saying that we're still shooting at American helicopters, and there is violence all around. It seems that the initial optimism about things coming to some kind of normalcy was perhaps too early or entirely misplaced. Mariam.
Well, on the helicopter crash, I'd like to say that the U.S. military regularly refuses to admit that the aircraft has been shut down, even when the ground fire has contributed to the crash. I have no evidence that this was the case in Logar, but it's worth treating their statement with some skepticism. The incident underlines the fact that no ceasefire exists with the Taliban despite the prisoner swap. Still, the release of 2 Western hostages should be understood as a confidence-building measure as the U.S., China, and Russia try to encourage the restart of the peace talks.
Okay. And what about the election commission? I mean, the results postponement, it seems there's some kind of, and obviously is something that probably the election commission knows best. There's some kind of, standoff there. Both the sides have already declared victories. And how is this going to work out if there is, in fact, some kind of standoff there?
I've mentioned this several times that I'm quite disappointed with the IEC. For the past 5 years, they have yet to establish itself as an institution that could be capable and transparent. Unfortunately, they have not. They've been going back and forth with the biometric votes. It's quite sad. There were a recent article mentioned that there's more drug users in Afghanistan than the number of voters that have come out. I think that the statements going back and forth between the top two teams mentioning who the winners are just confidence-building measures that they're trying to do with their own voters, because there is quite a deadlock in the democracy status in Afghanistan. Nobody has any hope, and just the stalemate of the peace talks as well has caused an insecurity amongst the people. Although that we have the peace, I feel that all of these are interconnected, whether they're the prisoner swaps, the peace talks, and the elections. The public within itself is just so exhausted and tired of the whole current political status that the loss of their hope is going to be a lack of public complicity to the rule of law. And I don't think that we, as world community, are taking this as a serious matter.
Okay, Mariam, I am going to ask you some more with reference to electioneering and the democratic processes in Afghanistan. But let me hop over to Imtiaz Gul here and get his thoughts on some of these developments. Imtiaz.
Well, the political landscape in Afghanistan remains as muddled as it had been until before the elections. There's very serious doubts about the credibility of the entire process. Dr. Abdullah has already, I think, withdrawn from his people from the entire process, the counting, recounting, and verification, biometric verification of the votes. This represents the government as well as the entire opposition with a huge challenge as to whether this small number of votes cast in these elections should really be treated as a representative vote when the election commission, if at all, decides to declare the winner. I think increasingly people are talking about the possibility of a new election altogether instead of a runoff, a second round, just because the election commission and the candidates failed to get a good number of people out into the electoral process. And I think this situation basically is still casting huge, massive uncertainty over the political developments in Afghanistan itself. Somehow it depends, I think, on it's incumbent more, I think, on President Ghani right now as to which course he takes once the election commission is ready to declare results.
I'm also joined by Pamir Patang, who's an analyst based in Kabul. As I said in my opening, he's at the funeral of Wahid Mujda, and I also mentioned that Mr. Mujda was a guest on this program. So condolences on this tragic event, and welcome to the program, Pamir Patang. Give us a sense of, I was also talking about the violence that is racking Afghanistan. What details, if any, do you have as reference to the murder last night of Mr. Mujda?
Well, thank you for having me in your program. Well, I mean, the investigation is still ongoing, but so far it's been deemed as an ordered killing. So the Ministry of Interior are investigating who might be behind this. So no information was released. Yes, the funeral had taken place today. It was attended by all the VIPs, including the former president, the chief executive officer, Mr. Abdullah, and most of the government high officials. So they have all paid their tribute and their condolences to the family. It is a tragic killing. Of course, it brings a concern to those who are both in the media as well as who are writers and analysts. So it was a very unfortunate loss for the government, for the people, for the nation. He was a great man, but unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
I hear you, Mr. Patang. This is indeed, as I said, very tragic. I understand the risks that writers and analysts and journalists have to take in order to write, analyze, and report in Afghanistan. But let me pull in Mariam on this. Mariam, we've seen, this is not the first time something like this has happened. There was a female journalist, I remember I had you on that program when we talked about it. Unfortunately, I forget her name, but she was also assassinated in broad daylight. So Is there any sort of sense within the government, and then of course President Ashraf Ghani was the president at that time, and Abdullah was the chief executive, that these writers and these analysts and people who are not really in armored cars need to have some kind of protection because the risks are high for them?
Well, unfortunately, I've mentioned this numerous times that the Afghan National Defense Security Forces are fighting so many battles. So they're fighting their own Afghans, which are the Afghan Taliban. Then they're also fighting the regional and international terrorists, which is Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And then they're also fighting criminal activity, which includes theft, robbery, murders, and along with kidnapping. I feel that there are way too many issues and not too many bodies of protection. The female that was murdered in broad daylight was Farishta Mangal, and unfortunately, it was dismissed as a personal matter. I feel that our interior forces, which are the Afghan National Police, are stretched very thin, and they're also not trained properly. I mean, they only get 6 weeks of training for them to be able to evaluate the case. I place some skepticism on it. I think that we need to focus more on the security within Kabul, because that's where all the incidents happen. It's not only analysts that have been died, but multiple provincial police chiefs have been killed in the past 2 months in Kabul. They have been shot. And not only have we had General Mariam Wardak, who is one of the top military analysts from the Ministry of Interior. He was murdered in his own home. General Wardak. So we have many incidents, and I feel that maybe these discussions are not happening at the leadership, at the National Security Council, maybe because the leaderships are informing President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah that we're handling the case, and they feel that the matter is taken care of. But in reality, everybody in Kabul, all citizens are at risk.
Yeah, I hear you. But here's the Ejaz Gul. Given all this, and these are various dots that we need to connect in order to try and figure out this situation. So there is an attempt to create a democracy. There's an attempt to have a constitution. There's an attempt to have those at least the form of those institutions. But despite 3 rounds of elections, it seems to me that those traditional fault lines still remain. Now, if that is correct, and if you agree with me, then I want you to give us a sense, since you go to Kabul so often, elsewhere in Afghanistan also, you have had track tours with Afghan analysts, journalists, and the rest of them. Give us a sense of how, if at all, can the situation be brought under control? Because it seems like there's a catch-22 here.
Yeah, Afghanistan certainly is in a catch-22 situation. It seems to be moving in cycles, very vicious cycles, which are defined or determined by a number of proxy factors and proxy forces. I think external influence weighs very heavily currently on Afghanistan. On the one hand, you see lobbies which are aligned with the US and Indian interests, and on the other hand, you see people who would like very much to lean on Pakistan for support. So right now you see all these external influences or conflicting interests are at play inside Afghanistan, I think, and that is making the reconciliation very difficult, I would say. The actual, I think, contest, I would say, based on my experience, is right now between India and Pakistan in a situation in which Pakistan is helping out. Pakistan has facilitated the reconciliation process, which has been duly acknowledged by the United States and other stakeholders, but not enough recognition has come from inside India, which I believe has played as a spoiler in the entire process, because it has very strongly deep interests within the governance structures of Afghanistan, particularly in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Interior, and the Defense Ministry. So also, I think I would say within the Commerce Ministry, that I think is a big, huge complicating factor. So the United States does not, I think, count as much as the hidden Indian hand in this entire process. And we really have to, I think, untie this knot. I don't know. I'm not sure whether Mariam or Pamir, who had been here in Pakistan, Islamabad for our track 2 as well a few months ago, whether they agree with me. But currently, it's a very, very unfortunate situation in which for a country which for 80-90% is dependent on external aid, but mostly by the United States, but where certain lobbies are working against the approaches that the United States has adopted for a possible way out of the ongoing conflict for peace efforts. So I think somehow we shall have to find a way.
Okay, obviously I'll take this question to Pamir and Mariam also, but just clarify this. We know that at least President Trump has constantly said he wants to get out of Afghanistan. So one way that he can get out of Afghanistan is for Afghanistan to become, to achieve some degree of normalcy. Now, if the Indians are playing this hand, I assume that the Americans would know that they're doing this, and so that goes against the U.S. interest.
Yeah, I guess the U.S. interlocutors would know about it, but look, it's a very intricate situation inside Afghanistan. The United States cannot simply call out India, saying that, well, stop fiddling in the Afghan affairs. The same way as, they have been calling out Pakistan on this, but they would not call out India on this. However, there is still a big hope. And I think instead of imposing this Westminster style of democracy, there is what one should try to safeguard and preserve the system that has been put in place as a result of a constitution. However controversial that may be, but we have to acknowledge that there is edifice of democracy backed by the constitution. Taliban may not like it, but I think the international community, including Pakistan, should support that, and any future movement should be conditioned, should be made conditional to the acceptance of the constitution as the premise for any forward movement. And most importantly, let me just finish just in 10 seconds, that what the Afghan leaders, including President Ghani, need to do is to go back to the traditional way of conflict mitigation and resolution, that is the jirga. So going back to the community and not ruling Afghanistan like we do in Pakistan or India, or for that matter in the UK.
Okay. I have to stop you there, Imtiaz, because I'm left with just a couple of minutes and I need to get very quick takes of Pamir, who'll go first, and then Mariam. Pamir Patang.
Well, thank you. To an extent, I agree with Imtiaz, and I fully agree with Mariam. The problem remains, of course, I was at the Track 2 meeting myself in Islamabad, I think it was a couple of months ago. I think our Pakistani friends, they need to do more as well, because the finger are currently being pinpointed at Pakistan for giving housing and shelter to the most of the Taliban within their territory. I mean, with India, we don't really have any of those problems. India still remains probably one of the biggest donors to Afghanistan. The concern that Pakistan has over the relations that we have with India, I mean, we cannot just ruin our relationship with India purely because just to make Pakistan happy. Okay, the concerns that
I don't think, Pamir, let me just interject here. I don't think anyone in Pakistan is saying that Afghanistan does not have the right to have good relations with any country, including India. I think the concern has to do with how India is using the territory in so many ways. So I think that was what Imtiaz was pointing at. But let me quickly go to Mariam, because I have to wrap up. Mariam, your final thoughts, but very quickly.
I want to mention that the United States has called out India. President Trump has called out India at least twice. But I find that Pakistan is our immediate neighbor, and I would be, not only I, but I think all Afghan citizens would be so grateful that if our neighbor would take up more responsibilities, and it's more natural because we are side by side versus India. there's not much evidence that I can see face here on the type of proxy indications or the role that they're playing. Neither do the average citizens in Afghanistan. So they just see what's on hand. And I think that if Pakistan makes more of an attempt and tries more to work out certain matters, they will look better with the citizens of Afghanistan.
Okay. Mariam, I've run out of time. Thank you so much to Imtiaz Gul, Pamir Patang, Mariam Wardak for speaking with us. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.